So today I want to explain the argument from contingency. It's a theist argument, it's fairly popular. I just want to explain the system surrounding it and how the argument actually works. So we're going to discuss modality, necessity, contingency, the principle of sufficient reasoning, and the laws of logic. There are three main laws of logic, but today we're only going to be focusing on the law of non-contradiction. It basically says that nothing can both exist and not exist at the same time and in the same respect. So, for example, if I were to make the statement that I am outside, and then I were to say, I am not outside, these two statements are contradictory. They're in negation with each other, so they both cannot be true in the same time and in the same sense. So anything that doesn't invoke this idea of a contradiction is what we consider logically possible. So we would say anything that does not have a contradiction exists in some possible world. Logic determines possibility. There are different types of possibility, as in physical possibility, which breaks the laws of physics, but that is irrelevant to the conversation of modal laws. Possible worlds are just things that contain a set of possibilities that didn't actually happen. And each possible world then in turn would have possibilities that didn't happen in that world, creating another possible world and another possible world, making them infinite. So now that we know what possible worlds are, we can discuss what necessity and contingency is. A necessity, or a necessary fact, is just something that exists in all possible worlds, as in it cannot fail to exist. An example of this would be the laws of logic, as in the laws of logic determine what is even possible, so they must exist in all possible worlds, while a contingent fact is something that only exists in some possible worlds. An example of this could be myself. My own existence could have not been. Anything that could have not been is a contingent fact. The reason why it could have not been is my parents could have never met, or their parents could have never met. I never would have been born. So in some possible world, I don't exist. And then there's the principle of sufficient reasoning. I admit there's actually numerous versions of this. I'm using something called the weak PSR, which only means that for any contingent fact, this fact requires an explanation for its existence. I would argue the principle of sufficient reasoning's truth is tautological to the definition of a contingent fact. What I mean by this is, what a contingent fact is means it requires a definition. If we take a look at the example I gave of my birth, my existence, the reason why this is contingent is because it's dependent on an event happening that caused it. So that gives it its contingency. So for any contingent fact you name, this fact is reliant upon something. Right? So my house, it's reliant upon what it's built. The clothes I'm wearing, it's reliant upon what they're made out of. All of these things. So they could have not been. But the laws of logic, what are they reliant on? Nothing. They are necessities. Lastly, in order to understand this argument, you must be familiar with the BCCF, or the Big Conjunctive Contingent Fact. What this essentially means is, if we were to take all contingent facts and put them into a group, the group itself is a contingent fact because all of its functioning parts are. So, following the principle of sufficient reasoning, this also requires an explanation. But it is unlike any other individual contingent fact. Its explanation cannot also be contingent because its explanation will be inside itself. Now, this leads to modal problems, modal collapse, which is not really accepted in a lot of philosophy. What modal collapse means is necessitarianism, which I'll talk about more in depth later if you guys want to. So, that means the explanation to this cannot be a contingent explanation. It must be a necessary one. Now, going further in this argument, I think is kind of pointless because this is where I think it ends. Theistically, it's accepted that this necessary explanation is God, quote unquote. I actually do have my own problems with this argument, and in a future video, I could make a debunk video of this argument, which I think has major problems in and of itself. Leave in the comments if that's something anybody would be interested in.